All right. I think we should get started. Thank you all very much for coming in for our panel and to our panelists here. I'm sure many others will come in, but in the interest of time, we will get started. I'm Fatima Keshavarzian, professor of Persian and director of Roshan Institute for Persian Studies, located in the School of Languages, Literatures, and Cultures in University of Maryland, College Park. I welcome you to our Elahe Mirjalali Omidyar speaker series, which usually has annual events, and we do sometimes have events other than speaking, but in this case, this panel is very much needed and timely, so we thought to give some close thinking and looking at the protests going on in Iran and see what we may learn about it more than we already know. I'm not going to give a big background. I'm pretty sure most of you are familiar with the fact that the uprisings in Iran started with the death of Mahsa Amini in police custody, usually referred to as morality police, in Iran known as Gasht-e Irshad, or the kind of guidance patrol or something in that vicinity. The movement, which was at the beginning focusing very heavily on women's issues, and it still is, as women go on burning their scarves in the street, and more than that, asking for their voices to be heard and their leadership to be acknowledged. But the demands of the movement has expanded far beyond that, and issues such as the corruption of the government, the lack of freedom for civic activities and engagements, of course, the economic problems, but many, many issues that Iranians have in the past few years in particular been very seriously dealing with. The events actually grow on the and change on the ground with a dizzying speed. It's hard to catch up and be updated. We were just talking about the horrendous fire in Evin prison and about the fact that the casualties formally have been reported as 4, possibly more. Others are telling us 61 injured at least. And very, very sadly, we have these conversations about political prisoners in which part of the prison, as if it would be okay to just have people for political difference to be in prison. And equally badly, the others are referred to as Arazel and Obash. Basically, I don't know how would we even translate that? Arang, what would you say? or Sima,
not pulled, but thugs, yeah.
Yeah.
Thieves and thugs.
Thugs, yes, thugs, I think, really. And so the whole thing is really moving on and developing and into something far more than it was, but initially started. It is important, however, to follow the facts. And I think the best we can do, the best tribute really we can pay to the Iranians who go out on the street, and every time they do, they're putting their lives on the line. The best thing we could do for them is to create opportunities where we could have fact-based, nuanced conversations about what is going on and what we could hope to see happening as a result of that. So we have a wonderful a panel here of colleagues, and besides them, we have John, our colleague, our own previous student, now a colleague, and absolutely fluent in Persian and very much following what is going on in Iran. So he's helping us. I want to introduce our first speaker, Professor Sima Shakhsari. She is an associate professor and the co-chair of the Department of Gender, Women, and Sexuality Studies, an affiliate of the Department of Asian and Middle Eastern Studies, as well as an affiliate of the Interdisciplinary Center for Global Change. That is very interesting. I'm so glad that you have your hands also in the global matters, and I'm not surprised. At the University of Minnesota. Dr. Shakhsari received their PhD in anthropology from Stanford University and has held postdoctoral positions at the University of Houston and the University of Pennsylvania. Their book, Politics of Rightful Killing, Gender, Sexuality, and Civil Society in Weblogistan, was published in 2020 by Duke University Press. She was the recipient of the Middle East Studies Association's Fatima Mernissi Honorable Mention. Professor Shakhsari, welcome. And we are excited to hear from you, and the fact that this movement has had such a significant gender dimension to it, it adds even more to the fact that we have you, the significance of the fact that we have you here to speak to us. Please.
Thank you so much, Dr. Keshavarzian. I'm honored to be a part of this wonderful panel and in conversation with you and Negar and Arang. And thank you, John, for your work on this, as well as your center, Elohimir Jalali Umidiyar series. And to all the audience for joining us on a Sunday. I would like to start with acknowledging that I live in the Twin Cities, Minnesota, which is the current and ancestral land of the Dakota and Ojibwe peoples. And I live not very far from Fort Snelling, the site of forced encampment of 1,700 indigenous people, mostly women, children, and the elderly, and where over 300 indigenous men were brutally hanged by the United States government. And I make this point and this land acknowledgement not as a neoliberal multicultural gesture, but it is a part of my political and theoretical commitment and grounding, which is informed by transnational feminist approach, a kind of a transnational feminist approach that pays attention to relations of power and inequalities of power geographically and temporally. And in a sense, it refuses the binaries of local, global, national, international, and so on and so forth, and instead looks at nationalisms, supranational forms of power relations, be it state or non-state entities, which includes diasporas, human rights entities, NGOs, corporations, and so on and so forth. And so this grounding, this kind of grounding takes histories of colonialism and settler colonialism and imperialism, of course, seriously, to think about past and present, as well as the future, here and there, all of them on the same plane of analysis. And it refuses historical amnesia that is only focused on the here and now. And I think that is really important to think about today, about the movement and what some people have called the revolution of the Iranian people, with the leadership of Iranian women on the streets of Iran, people who are risking their lives as we speak. Before I talk about my view on the protests, or perhaps as a way to approach it, I also want to make a disclaimer, and that is that my identities as an Iranian, queer, non-binary, or trans person do not translate into me speaking on behalf of the Iranian people or the Iranian queers or Iranian women or Iranian trans people, etc. But unfortunately, we see a lot of people speaking on behalf of all Iranian people, as if such a thing is possible, or giving voice to those who are assumed to be voiceless victims, and need to be given a voice. And of course, this issue of giving voice has been problematized by many feminist scholars, including Fatima's reading more than, well, Jasmine and the Stars reading more than Lolita in Tehran. So I'm neither speaking on behalf or giving voice to those Iranians who are on the streets of Iran protesting in several cities and also rural areas. And if anything, I'm trying to learn from them. And I'm only speaking as a scholar whose scholarship and activism has been grounded in transnational feminist theory and also a radical queer critique that refuses to take a single issue approach and instead pays attention to queer possibilities and complexities and complicities as well. And I think, I personally see a lot of potential and possibility in the women-led movement, and in particular their slogan, Woman, Life, Freedom, Zan Zindagi Azadi, which hopefully in the Q&A we can talk about more. So that multi-issue approach is one that unfortunately is not given any room these days, in particular in the diaspora among some of the opposition groups, be it the royalists or the so-called left. I call them chap to guillemets, or left in quotation marks, because I have skepticism about how one can be so complicit with neocons and conservatives and call themselves left. So we have seen this form of narrow approach to movements in the past too, of course. During the 1979 revolution, when Iranian women tried to address gender discrimination, they were told to wait and not to dilute the revolution or the movement, that this is not the right time. And in fact, this has been the case not just in Iran, but in many movements around the world, including in anti-colonial movements, social justice movements, and so on and so forth. So we see that today again. And when multiple issues are connected to each other, be it gender, be it geopolitics, or more specifically, the US geopolitical interests in the region, accusations of impeding the movement are thrown liberally at those of us who refuse to take a single issue approach. I'll bring an example. We just recently issued a statement from faculty and students at the University of Minnesota in support of the protests in Iran. And we clearly condemn the Iranian state's brutal attacks on the protesters at Sharif University, on the streets of Iran, as well as in the high schools, and connected these attacks through the logic of securitization to the killings of George Floyd, Donta Wright, Jamar Clark, and other Black people who were killed by the racist US police in Minnesota and in the US. And interestingly, this statement was accused by some as being conservative and complicit with the Islamic Republic. Now, that accusation to me is a symptom of a tunnel vision that only tackles one issue at a time and doesn't allow any analysis that adds nuance to the Iranian protests. Any kind of nuance is accused by some people in diaspora of collusion with the Iranian state, which is also a very interesting accusation because it shares this Manichaean logic with the Iranian state, who accuses any critique of the state of foreign collusion or foreign propaganda. And we have seen this for years, it's not new. So just making it clear that I'm fully and wholeheartedly in support of the Iranian women's leadership and the Iranians who are protesting on the streets of Iran against state repression, be it in the form the repression being in the form of forced confessions, house arrest, imprisonment, brutal killings, and so on and so forth. And I'm wholeheartedly with the people who are fed up with the state because of the repression, because of economic austerities, because of corruption, economic corruption. And I'm against the instrumentalization of and control of women's bodies, be it through compulsory hijab in post-revolutionary Iran, forced removal of hijab during Reza Shah's period, the ban of hijab in France or some European countries, or ban and restrictions on abortion in the US. And this is connecting, this is not diluting the movement, it's making connections. And that is, like I said, is my transnational feminist grounding. So, and that also includes the instrumentalization of women's bodies by the opportunistic opposition groups, whose extent of attention to women's rights has been the strategic deployment of images of Iranian women as victims or heroes, but never as political subjects. They're just become symbols, and their voices again are erased and muted. And that is what we see in mainstream media representations, be it in Iran International, Voice of America, Manitou, and so on and so forth. And by the way, Iran International and Voice of America are also media channels that are funded by states that have geopolitical interests in regime change in Iran. That is not a secret. And also this form of silencing happens through nationalist and heteronormative representations, wherein the Iranian map is, for example, portrayed as a beautiful woman's face or body to be loved and protected by the brave man of nations. So there's this heteronormative narrative of love through nationalist notions of manhood and protection. And women almost never are portrayed as political subjects who have a voice. They're portrayed as voiceless victims who need to be given a voice. I was speaking to an Iranian women's rights activist who was very upset about how the Iranian women activists' efforts to center women in their woman life freedom slogan has been sidelined and erased and only used strategically by some of these groups. I don't know if I have more time to say a few words about the reason we see this protest, or should I keep that for the Q&A?
I think a few more minutes would be perfectly fine, please.
Thank you, thank you. So I just want to say a few words about why the protests, why we see these massive protests. And, as many people have said, the protests are not about religion, even though, the outside of Iran, again, they have been appropriated as such for Islamophobic purposes sometimes. And neither they're just about compulsory hijab. They're really a kind of, compilation or the coming together of 43 years of resentment after the Iranian state has really failed to live up to its promises of freedom and justice, economic justice. So, after Pahlavi regimes, immense gap, economic gap between what the post-revolutionary state called Taghuts and the working classes and the farmers. The promise was that the Islamic state, the Iranian state, the Islamic Republic was going to bring equality, and that equality has not materialized. And a part of that is, of course, years, over 4 decades of sanctions that have become worse over time, in particular under Trump. And those sanctions have made life impossible and made access to life-saving medicine impossible for majority of Iranians. And of course, whenever there are sanctions, there are sanctions profiteering. We saw that in Iraq too. The sanctions did not really hurt the elites. They're not hurt in Iraq. They're not hurting the elite in Iran. They're only increasing the economic gap and giving opportunities for economic corruption and sanctions profiteering. And that kind of the economic pressure of the sanctions put together with the liberalization of the Iranian economy that has accelerated, in particular in recent years, privatization of education and so on and so forth, have given rise to massive protests. Just this July, there were protests by teachers, by government workers, because people's wages were held because of the economic, basically catastrophe that Iranians are facing. So these are kind of connected. So added to the economic injustices and frustrations, there's also lack of freedom. And while the Iranian state used Iranian women's bodies, again, as a symbol to anti-imperialism, to opposition to the so-called West and anti-imperialism, and kind of promised different kinds of freedom, those freedoms actually not only have not been realized, but they have become, the repression is unbearable. I also want to mention something, because some people, when they talk about social freedoms, because of a kind of historical amnesia, there seems to be no memory for some newer generations in particular, and the monarchists have been doing a good job of portraying the Pahlavi era as the era of freedom. No, that wasn't the case. It was actually because of the number of political prisoners, because the most mundane things, such as books of Samad Behrangi, children's book, Mahi Siyah Kuchulu, were banned, that the revolution came into culmination in 1979. So Islamic Republic kind of positioning itself in juxtaposition or in opposition to Pahlavi regime's repression has not really delivered those freedoms. And I think the combination of economic injustices and lack of social freedoms that have been worsened by the economic sanctions have really created this situation where people are fed up, and there's this impossible situation where a lot of people who were reformists in the past are saying that the establishment cannot be reformed at this point because the situation is so dire. So I'll stop here, and hopefully we'll have more time to talk about the sanctions and their effects, in particular on women, if you're interested. But thank you.
Thank you so much, Sima. That was a fantastic entrance into the subject, which is very complex, as you have made very clear. Okay, Jana, do you have Negar's?
I do.
So please go ahead.
Negar Mortazavi is an award-winning journalist and political commentator and editor and host of the Iran podcast based in Washington, D.C. She has been covering Iranian and Middle Eastern affairs, as well as U.S. foreign policy toward the Middle East for over a decade. Negar is a frequent media commentator and has appeared on CNN, NBC, NPR, BBC, France 24, Al Jazeera, and other global outlets. She has written for Foreign Policy Magazine, Politico, The Intercept, The Independent, and other publications, and is regularly invited to speak at panels and conferences around the world about Iranian affairs and U.S. foreign policy. Negar has been featured in Forbes among 30 inspirational women who are breaking boundaries in their work and life. She's been named by Middle East Policy Council among 40 under 40 leaders shaping the present and future of U.S. Middle East relations, and among 40 under 40 Iranian Americans who have made an enormous impact on their community and country. She was named a rising star in U.S. foreign policy by New America Foundation and also by the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and in 2017 was named a Young Leader by Friends of Europe, a prominent European institution based in Brussels. Negar was previously a television anchor for Voice of America, where she hosted a Persian talk show on current affairs and an English news show on U.S. elections. She was also a Washington correspondent for Iran International Television and worked at the International Center for Journalists, the National Iranian American Council, and the United Nations Development Program in New York. Negar received her master's degree from Brandeis University and her bachelor's degree from the University of Massachusetts. She lived in Iran and Germany, immigrated to the United States in 2002, and has been forced into exile since 2009.
Thank you so much, John. I don't think I can add anything to that. Maybe just that Negar has also had a career of attending university events at Princeton and Harvard, and Michigan, UPenn, and they have next week, I believe, in Chicago. But so we're really delighted to have you with us, Negar. Please, as a journalist, Iranian American journalist, who's very much focused on Iran, but also in global journalism, I think you can talk to us about what you see as the various dimensions of what you see the news media now dealing with the current situation in Iran.
Thank you so much to the Roshan Center, University of Maryland, Fatemeh, John, Marjan, and your colleagues for putting together this excellent and timely panel. It's a pleasure and honor to be here together with Sima, Arang, and thanks to your audience for tuning in on a Sunday. I must say, I do a lot of media interviews, but university panels are my favorites. You have time to just talk about this issue more comprehensively and not in 2-minute television soundbite. So it's a pleasure to be here. Let me just start by giving a quick recap of what's been going on for your audience. So protests broke out in Iran in September after the death in police custody of a young Kurdish woman, Jina or Mahsa Amini, 22-year-old, who was arrested and taken to detention by the morality police and ends up in a coma in a hospital and then dies. Immediately, the state puts out a story that she had a heart problem and died of an underlying health condition. This narrative has been challenged by her family to this day. Her family has been under a lot of pressure to not speak to the media, to not challenge the state narrative. And also, as far as the funeral, they're from the Kurdish region in Iran, in the west, the city of Saqqez, and the family was under pressure for the state to make sure the funeral doesn't turn into a protest. Nevertheless, protests broke out in Kurdistan, in Tehran, and across the country, spread to every province in Iran, and is centered, what I find incredible and unique about these protests is that it's centered on a women's rights issue, essentially in the death of this woman, and women and young girls front and center demanding basic freedoms, dignity, and end to discrimination. And then we also have this intersectional communities of protesters joining in with their own layers of grievances, but also with a lot of overlap with political grievances, economic grievances, social, cultural, and joining these protests that what's essentially a feminist uprising by women, girls, and allies, but also turning into mass protests against the government as a continuation of previous years of protests, of mass protests that we've seen. 2009, the Green Movement, 2019, after a hike in fuel prices, and in between the various protests that we've seen. We saw school children joining the protests, school girls and also boys, high schoolers. We saw teachers, university students, lawyers, and most recently oil workers joining the protest. I was checking the latest update by Amnesty International. They do the very difficult job of documenting the deaths from mostly outside the country. It says 144, at least 144 have been documented killed protesters by Amnesty International. This is until October 3rd, and including 23 children. So protesters or students under the age of 18, boys and girls. And we also have other human rights organizations documenting, for example, Human Rights Watch. I want to read about the violence from their report, saying the security forces are unlawfully using excessive lethal force against protesters, assault rifles, shotguns, handguns using against protesters in largely peaceful and often crowded settings, killing and injuring hundreds, in some cases even shooting at people who were running away, so from behind. The violence, the brutality is massive across the country by security forces. We're seeing images, horrific images of how the security forces are confronting the protesters. It seems to be going with the same playbook that was used in 2009, in 2019, and also at every other round of mass protests. And the crackdown in the past has sent people back home without really addressing their political, economic, social grievances. And so every time these intersectional communities come back on the street with new layers of grievances, and the government, the Islamic Republic, the regime is essentially dealing with a serious crisis of legitimacy. That we hear very radical slogans by the protesters against the entirety of the Islamic Republic, the entirety of the state, its very senior leaders, corruption by government officials, and this outpouring of anger, not just at the death of one young woman, Mahsa Amini, or the violence of the morality police or mandatory hijab, but also at a system that has systematically enforce this various levels of discrimination on women and also on men, working class, middle class, while the average Iranian also sees the political elite not only have access to obviously political positions, economic prosperity, but also social freedom. So if you are a wealthy class, either attached to the political elite or not so much, in a large city in Tehran, you can essentially buy your freedom from the morality police. If you drive a fancy car with tinted windows, if you live in a fancy house or party in fancy villas, the level of freedom that elite has access to is very different from what a middle class or a working class young woman deals with. The woman who has to take the metro, the woman who has to take the bus, like Mahsa Amini. Those are the ones mostly confronted or picked up by the morality police and then subjected to this violence. In the case of Mahsa Amini, lethal violence and her death in custody. So it's an incredible moment that we're witnessing in Iran, but it's also a continuation of not only decades of pushback against the Islamic Republic, but over 100 years of women and a movement of women fighting for freedom, fighting for equality since the constitutional revolution in Iran, throughout the years of the monarchy. Even during the revolution, the 1979 revolution, women played a front and center role in the revolution, mostly demanding political freedoms, as Sima talked about. And then right after the revolution, with the imposition of the mandatory hijab, also one of the first protests after the revolution was by women. Thousands of women took to the streets in the first anti-mandatory hijab protest in Tehran, which nevertheless the mandatory hijab was imposed and then enforced with this violent force that is the morality police or gasht irshad or guidance patrol over the years. I also want to emphasize that women have been fighting. This is not the first instance. Women have been fighting for the past 4 decades and pushing back the limits of what the state deems acceptable as far as their dress code, but also it's not only dress code, it's also your behavior. So this gasht irshad is supposed to guide, quote unquote, guide women and men on how they're presented in the public. And it's essentially turned into a form of public harassment, mostly against women. So it starts with the dress code, but there's discrimination throughout women's personal and professional lives, in family law, in marriage and divorce, child custody, inheritance. In so many levels, women have been dealing with this state-sanctioned discrimination, which also with violence is enforced on them. I'll give you an example. If you are a married woman, you need permission from your husband to travel outside the country. So there was this famous story of an athlete, a national athlete, who was a captain of a national team. So a woman at the highest level of sport, and her husband didn't let her travel for an international competition. So the team went to that international competition, but this captain had to stay behind. And this humiliation and the discrimination that women have been dealing with the past 4 decades is just something that we're seeing right now, this a combination of anger and outpouring with multiple underlying grievances and other layers. As Sima pointed out, the economic situation, we see working class Iranians also protesting. This was back in 2019. And since then, we've seen different sections of the society, teachers, oil workers, labor unions protesting and demanding better pay, better work conditions, economic justice. There's underlying political grievances, but the people don't see any other avenue to pursue political change other than the street, basically. We see a very strong presence by university students, hear very radical chants against the entirety of the system and the regime, its senior leadership at universities. So I can go on and on. I don't know how much more time I have.
Thank you so much. I think this is fantastic, and there will be plenty of time in question and answer time for you to also hear from the audience and also answer those questions. So there will be other chances. That was fantastic. So our last but by no means least panelist, Dr. Arang Keshavarzian is by the way, no relations. We know each other for a long time because many years ago, Arang as an undergraduate wasn't one of my classes, but that, so it's really wonderful to see him in the form of the, very developed and complex and scholar who could address issues as the situation that we are dealing with right now. Arang is a faculty member at New York University's Department of Middle Eastern and Islamic Studies. His research and teaching interests include the politics and political economy of Iran and the Persian Gulf region. He is the author of Bazar and State in Iran and the co-editor of the 2021 released Global 1979 Geographies and Histories of the Iranian Revolution. In the past 2 decades, he has been an editor and regular contributor to Middle East Report MEREP. So just shortening all the bios in order to give people more chance to talk. Arang John, the floor is yours. Take it away and tell us where we are and where we are going. Isn't that an easy question?
Thank you very much. Not an easy question, but I'm fortunate to speak after Sima and Negar and their wonderful presentations. So it's actually pretty difficult to follow up their outlining of the current conjuncture in Iran. But let me first thank the University of Maryland, especially Dr. Keshavarzian and Dr. Mullen for inviting me. I thought in my opening remarks, I'll try to keep them short to 10, 12 minutes. I'll actually try to give you a little bit about the socioeconomic context in which these protests are unfolding. I think the previous presenters did a wonderful job of that, but let me try to add some other additional dimensions. Now, let me pick up one theme that Negar raised in her presentation. It's important to remember that Iran has had regular, persistent protests for many, many years. It's different sectors, different segments, different even regions of the country, but it's been a characteristic of Iranian society for at least 15 years, if not longer, where you have different teachers, nurses, bus drivers, oil workers, pensioners, you name it, taking to the streets for various demands, including environmental issues, including cost of living issues, a variety of issues. But one thing I want to point out is I have been struck, especially in comparison even to 2009, the amount of international solidarity. Now we can critique some of it. We can say some of this is virtual signaling and just people going on Twitter and gesturing and so forth. But I think it is significant. And in part it's significant because we do have to come to terms with one very foundational issue, unfortunately, and that is that no society treats men and women equally. No society pays them equally, gives them the same opportunities in education, politics, the labor market. It's not true in the United States, China, India, Germany, and not even the Scandinavian countries. We have persistence of pay gaps, we have unequal representation in government, and in many, many other dimensions. Iran is no different. In fact, Iran's treatment of women is significantly and strikingly horrific in this inequality. But one thing I want to point out, which is somewhat missed in some of the discussion, is that there's a sharp contrast or a certain kind of jagged edge to the treatment of women that's both systemic but also arbitrary. And here, let me just kind of juxtapose some kind of socioeconomic indicators of this. When we look at education and health, Iranian women have made important strides towards equality, both because of state policies, but also in spite of them. So just to remind you, literacy rates in Iran for those under the age of 40 are basically 90–95%, and they have been at this high rate for over 15 years. So incredibly literate population, but not just literate. When we look at secondary and post-secondary education, men and women have equal rates and extremely high rates of attendance in high schools and then post-secondary. And when I say high, I'm comparing Iran not just to the past, but also other middle-income countries, so countries that with comparable per capita income levels. When we look at maternal mortality, a very good indicator of women's access to health and empowerment and so forth. Maternal mortality rates in Iran are in fact lower than the United States. That I understand the United States is not a great benchmark for this, unfortunately, but it is significant that Iran's maternal mortality in the last few years is incredibly impressive, and on par with countries with much higher incomes per capita. When we measure, when we think about women's control over their lives in terms of the age of marriage, the gap between the age of husbands and wives, when the number of children, or the fertility rate. These are all measures of women having a degree of control and even power in their in the family. And we see huge strides made in recent years, especially for women under the age of 40 in all of these categories. Now, these socioeconomic rates, as I've already mentioned, have improved dramatically in recent decades. And they are comparable and oftentimes in better standing than other countries in comparable income levels. However, and this was already alluded to by all the speakers, when we look at in the area of law, for instance, women are basically treated like second-class citizens when it comes to divorce, child custody, inheritance, and a whole other slew of legal realms. When we look at women's representation in government, whether it's parliament, city councils, or cabinets of government, it's abysmally low. And this is in comparison to many other Muslim majority countries and middle income countries. I'm not comparing Iran here to European countries and so on and so forth. I'm comparing Iran to other countries with other similar standing. And finally, despite the incredible strides in terms of women's education, when we look at women's labor market participation, at least for the official labor market statistics, it is shockingly low. Not only low, it hasn't increased over these decades, but it's incredibly low even when we look at Iran in comparison to other middle income and even low income countries. And so in terms of the job market, in terms of economic power, women have been shortchanged. Now, clearly women, especially young women, have concrete grievances that are related to all of these factors that I have mentioned and the previous speakers have mentioned. And they've taken to the streets calling for greater equality and to overturn a system of systematic inequality and arbitrary enforcement of these laws. And I appreciate both the comments of the previous speakers about thinking about how this is arbitrarily enforced, but also enforced in very classist and classed ways. Now, all of these factors affect Iranian women. Obviously, depending on one's class background, regional background, ethnic background, if one lives in a small town, a village, an urban center, these inequalities affect people differently. But given the scope, the national scope of these protests, and what's important to note is that as early as the third or fourth day after the death of Gina Amini, these protests became national. It clearly struck a chord with women, but also men across the country. So it transcends a lot of other differences. But here, let me add, that it's not just grievances. Here, we sometimes forget that not only have Iranian women struggled and confronted these inequalities, but they've developed a vocabulary, a consciousness, and a discourse about this inequality. And much of the history of the last 2 decades in this past 3 weeks has completely been skipped over. It's as if Iran had a revolution in 1979 and then nothing happened until 2022. Let me just pause here and just give you a very, some things to think about. Since the late 1990s, if we just pause, we can see a plethora of organizations, media outlets, and campaigns that have provided women and mobilized women around tools to identify and confront patriarchy and sexism, right? And here I'm referring to a whole slew of magazines and newspapers, Zanan magazine, probably the most famous, but many, many others. I'm referring to the 1 million signature campaign, an important campaign going back many years that sought to address legal inequalities. We may critique it and think it was reformist and naive or whatever, but it literally tried to penetrate houses and families to introduce the discussion about legal equality. I'm talking about such projects as websites around, such as Harassment Watch, which have tried to deal with street harassment in streets and subways and so forth with apps and media outlets and social platforms. I'm referring to the rather vociferous Me Too campaign in Iran over the last 5-6 years. So just while the United States and other parts of the world had developed a Me Too campaign in Iran as well, there was a very strong an articulate Me Too campaign unfolding in Iran over the last 3 years. A lot of this targeted the areas of entertainment and the arts, but it extended even to university professors and so on and so forth. In all of these initiatives of the past two decades, women acquired as I said, a consciousness, a vocabulary, a sense that their plight it resonates across society. They developed a sense of empathy and so forth. So when a few weeks ago, the Kurdish slogan, "Women, Life and Freedom," began to circulate, it found this highly fertile social and political space in which it could be quickly picked up by Iranian women and men. It resonated with them. It made sense to them and it allowed them to articulate things that they had experienced for years, for decades, right? And projects they were involved in for years. And we cannot lose sight of all of this, for lack of a better term, activism, grassroots activism of various sorts that has been taking place under very difficult conditions for the past 20 years at least. And of course, it goes back decades, as was mentioned, over a century. Now, I don't want to paint too rosy of a picture. Alongside of the slogan "Women, Life, Freedom" and the women-centered approaches, there has been, frankly, quite disgusting misogyny on the streets of Tehran, on the streets of the United States, and in the social media space. The slogans, the slurs, the mockery of women, women's sexuality is rife, and it sits alongside of that. So we have to be vigilant and not be simply fooled by a notion that this is a feminist revolution. There's a feminist revolution, but there are lots of other politics swirling and swimming around right before our eyes. If I can have a couple more minutes.
Yeah, sure, please.
I just wanted to pivot here and point out that a lot of the, as I mentioned, a lot of commentaries in English as well as in Persian, there hasn't been much discussion of the past, especially the past few decades. It's as if we've gone from one rupture in 1979 to another. When we have talked about the past, it has been exclusively about 1978 and 1979. So commentators over the last 2-3 weeks very quickly have gravitated to look for parallels. Has the bazaar closed? Because it closed in 1978, and we all know that was important. Have the oil workers gone on strike? If they have, that's great news, because we know that was really important in 1979. In the past 12 hours, tragically, we saw Evin prison catch on fire. Within minutes of it, there were comparisons made to the tragic Cinema Rex fire in Abadan in 1978. While yes, the revolution of 1979 is important and it shapes all of us. We are all, in some senses, children of the 1979 revolution. I do want to warn against this very, frankly, a very sophomoric understanding of history, a very poor theory of history. History is not a model. It doesn't simply repeat itself. It doesn't simply carry the exact same consequences with it. Also, I warn against this kind of simplistic 1979 parallel because it denies the people in Iran the ability to conjure up new repertoires of protest, new attempts to challenge the state that make sense into today's Iran of 2022, not the Iran of 1979. What I was trying to point out with those statistics and that data is that how much Iran has changed over the last 4 decades. So let me point to one hopeful place that I've been thinking about. Oftentimes when we talk about the protests in schools and universities, we think of this as limiting, narrow, right? Because Well, okay, it's good that university students protest, but they always protest. We need the good, strong men, and it's not a coincidence, men in the factories to protest. We want the men in the bazaars to go on strike. And we want, until they come into the picture, we think the revolution will not really fully take off. But let me just pause for a second. You know, those numbers about literacy and education that I rattled off, these are important because schools and universities are some of the truly national institutions that we have in Iran. The teachers' movement, the mobilization of teachers around unionization, about better work conditions, is a truly national movement, right? So to me, it's actually quite significant that schools and universities are a space and a place for dissent. We have almost 30,000 high schools and vocational schools in Iran today. So even if 1% of these schools have protests every day, we're talking about 300 protests. That is a lot for the security forces to handle. We have about 3 million university students or post-secondary students in universities and other kind of sorts of programs. 3 million, that's a huge number. We have 2,500 institutions of higher learning. They're in big cities, medium cities, and small towns. If these spaces are unrulable, are disobedient, are challenging authorities, whether it's at the school level or at the level of the leader, the supreme leader, this is incredibly difficult for the security forces to marshal. And let me add, yes, these are young people, they are courageous and they're brave. But here I'm going to speak like an old man who's a parent. These young people have parents. It's clear from what we've seen in past 2-3 weeks, the parents don't simply stay home. They go to the prison to save their kids. They come to the streets, they support them. So while, yes, there is a generational dynamic that we need to analyze and think about, but I do warn against thinking about these generations as completely isolated from one another. These 15, 16, 18-year-olds have parents too. So we have to think across, as the other speakers have pointed out, we have to think about cross-class, cross-ethnic boundaries, but also across generations if we want to actually see these protests arrive at a truly transformative change in Iran.
Thank you very much to all of you for really giving us so much to learn and to think about. In fact, I have multiple comments in the chat that says, I'm sorry, in the Q&A that says, that even though they thought they were familiar with this topic, that they find themselves learning a lot from the panelists. This is really what the university is about, and this is what we are hoping would happen to at least some of the people who have attended today. So there are a lot of questions. Before I go to those questions, I would use my prerogative as the convener to ask one question that, or maybe in the future I'll insert one or two others as well, that has been really on my mind, and that's addressed to Negar. I was wondering, Negar, since you are both in the Iranian news environment as well as the global news environment, and we have been talking all about women out there, their limits, their possibilities, and so forth. Can you address that? What are some of the issues that, as women in the news media, you all feel globally, or as an Iranian American, whichever you want to focus on? Maybe the two are very related. So I think that would be really great to hear.
Sure, thank you so much for that great question. Let me first talk about the journalists who have been targeted and arrested in Iran. CPJ, the Committee to Protect Journalists, has documented at least 40 journalists who, and many women. We see a lot of women. I want to name some of them. Nilufar Hamedi, who's a young journalist who went to the hospital and tweeted that first photo of Mahsa, Jina, and Mini's parents, essentially signaling to the world that not all is okay at that hospital. She was soon arrested after. Her Twitter is now deactivated. Elahe, Elnaz Mohammadi, twin sisters, Vida Rabbani, also a journalist, Yalda Mayeri, photojournalist, and many more, women and men. But it's incredible that we see a large number of women leading the protests, women in the deaths, in the arrests, and also the women journalists were being targeted. And for those of us outside in the diaspora or in exile, I'm an exile journalist myself. Many of my colleagues or former colleagues at Voice of America, BBC Persian, Radio Farda, and other Persian outlets outside the country are doing the very difficult work of covering the country from the outside, many of them in exile with no access to the country, with a lot of pressure on their families from the regime. My own family has been harassed and pressured by the Revolutionary Guard over the years for my work. Many of these journalists are under a lot of pressure inside the country, their families, and also they're being targeted online with a lot of toxicity and harassment and threats. When I'm talking about threats, death threats, rape threats, mostly targeting women, and also with a lot of, as Arang mentioned, sexist, misogynistic, and very gendered language that when it's coming from the outside, from the opposition or the diaspora or the exile community, it's just disappointing and depressing, because you assume that people who live in democracies outside the country, all of us have trauma of the violence and the harassment of the regime, but in the midst of what we see as a feminist revolution or a women's revolution, this type of discourse and threats and the smear campaigns and the online harassment against journalists is just incredible. The New York Times reporter, who happens to be an Iranian woman, has been threatened and harassed so much that the New York Times had to issue 2 official statements condemning the attacks and supporting her. BBC World had to issue a statement just last week, 2 weeks ago, supporting BBC Persian journalists and condemning attacks by the regime and also by the opposition, who physically harassed a BBC Persian reporter who was there to cover the very protest by the opposition. I talked to a journalist at France 24, also an Iranian French journalist, a woman who was being harassed and smeared as an agent of the Islamic Republic. What's interesting is that for those of us working in the diaspora and exile, the regime accuses us of being agents of the respective countries or governments. I've been called the CIA agent and MI6 agent, depending on which outlet I work with. And then at the same time, from the outside, interest groups or some in the exile community, radical opposition, being smeared as agents of the Islamic Republic. I saw once this comment from the British ambassador in Tehran saying, the opposition calls BBC Ayatollah BBC, meaning that they're with the regime, and the hardliners or the Basij in Iran call them the MI6. So it would be great if these 2 groups could get together and talk to each other and understand what objectivity and professionalism and nuance mean. So it's a very difficult job. Obviously, the ones who are doing the heavy lifting inside the country, they're arrested, they're in detention, threats of arrest for those who aren't. Just incredible courage and bravery. But for us outside, it's also very difficult, very stressful. And I know, unfortunately, of women journalists, academics, and activists in the civil society who have altogether left social media. They've closed their accounts or they've become silent and inactive because of this very toxic and dangerous environment.
Thank you so much. I'm so sorry to hear that. I'm not surprised. And actually, even in Q&A, I can see, fortunately not many, but a few very unsavory comments. And
can I just clarify, Fatima John, one final point? I think it's a given, but let me just repeat it. As journalists, we welcome criticism of our work. Our work would have no meaning without the audience and their feedback. We constantly learn from the feedback from the audience. Criticism, very harsh criticism, but criticism is different than smears, than harassment, and then threats. So that's the campaigns and the environment that we're talking about.
Right. And certainly the university, and hopefully no place is the place for that. And I should also say that there are more than 1 or 2 or 3 statements actually in the Q&A that thank you for all the work that you do, Negar. So, you know, it is not just all one-sided, and it's good to know that. So let me go, there are questions coming in, and, you know, we on purpose dismantled the chat. This is a university. We want the environment of learning to be free of angry remarks about each other, but rather having a debate, a useful debate. But the Q&A is open, and I'll now start going through the questions, and hopefully we'll get time to address most of them, if not all. So,
could I make one point that to everyone in the audience, also this, I believe there will be a recording of this webinar available on our YouTube channel, uploaded in a few weeks, just in case anybody would like to review parts of the discussion. That's all.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Yes, so that's great. So one of the first questions is, it is heartening to see men joining the movement. Are they doing so to support women's issues or for their own reasons? Are they using women as a kind of front in the midst of such an authoritarian regime? Now, I will keep my own comment to myself. Should we go first? Let me first go to you, Sima, and then we can ask any of the other panelists who might want to comment on that.
Thank you. And I really enjoyed Negar and Arang's comments. I think, as I said, and also Arang and Negar pointed out, the protests that we see today don't come out of thin air. There has been a series of protests that have been happening, yes, 2019, 2017, 2009, and even before that, but also just this summer, like I said. And they were specifically about privatization of education that has, like Arang said, there have been many achievements that Iranian women have had in the realm of education and cultural realm, participation, women filmmakers and all that. In the realm of education in particular, this kind of privatization, many people are protesting to the fact that education and higher education is becoming less and less available to the ordinary people, to the working classes, and a selected few are getting access to the best schools and so on and so forth. So I don't think women's issues are necessarily separate from issues, grievances around class, because women also, we have women who are coming from working class. So the assumption that when we talk about women's movement, we are only talking about middle class women is itself, I think, a fallacy, that a lot of women who are a part of the protests are also working class women. So I think part of what I see, and I said that before, as a potential and the capacity of the woman life freedom is the way that many of, and I'm not generalizing about all the protesters, but many of the feminist protesters are making these connections. They refuse to separate these issues from each other, and they're approaching these issues in conjunction with one another. So I don't think the binary of woman man is very productive in thinking about this. I think yes, there are, as there have been, particular discourses that are very nationalist and masculinist that, as I said, use women as symbols of the nation, as objects to be protected, and so on and so forth. But women have been political actors in post-revolutionary Iran from day one, and they have achieved many victories, if you would. And I would say even in the realm of the government, I mean, we have had, Arang talked about education and, participation in many sectors, but also in the realm of the government. And many Iranian women have continuously nominated themselves for presidency despite the discriminatory laws, and that shows that Iranian women are active political subjects and have been. So whether men's participation or usage of the woman life freedom slogan or participation in this protest is just a ruse, I do not think so. As a matter of fact, I think that it's really productive to see every Iranian man, woman, non-binary people, and there are non-binary people in Iran, and queer and trans people in Iran, of course, but to kind of adhere to identitarian forms of politics in sense of, separating genders or so on and so forth, I don't think is very productive at this moment. I do have to say, however, when the slogan Zan Zendegi Azadi, which comes from the Kurdish slogan, as it was mentioned, Jan Jian Azadi, started to basically become very dominant and prominent in the protests, immediately there was a man mihan abadi, which to me is a really interesting way that, again, the assumption is that women are not capable of abadi, or development or prosperity of the nation. They're not capable, and it becomes, again, both a nationalist kind of move to talk about manhood, masculinity in relationship to the motherland, the Vatan and abadi. So, but I don't think, like I said, the Iranian women feminists in Iran and activists are very vocal, and the analysis that I don't know if you have been following some of the writings that come from Iranian women activists, they're very conscious of these and very strategic in the way that they're actually focusing. But unfortunately, as I said, and as it was mentioned, exactly because the Iranian state has made access to internet very difficult for most Iranians, the only, or most of the news that we get from Iran are from the kind of dominant news such as Iran International and so on and so forth, which produce a particular kind of narrative that, again, tries to attempt to sideline or erase the voices of Iranian women and Iranian feminists who are coming from Iran. And I think that a politics of solidarity is absolutely necessary, and we see that between ethnic minorities and working class advocacy groups, as well as feminist groups. And I think that is the potentiality of this movement for meaningful social change, and that is how.
Thank you so much. I couldn't have said it better at all. So I'm glad you went ahead with that. So actually, the related question that has come to us is, okay, so if men are outside and supporting women, working with them, and what are some of the other concrete demands that protesters are making? I mean, that's I think a very interesting question. I'm not sure if anybody has started doing a collecting of the slogans and a careful study of them. What most of us are hearing is a very clear and direct demand of a regime change. So this, this regime needs to go. This doesn't work anymore. That happens, of course, voiced in different ways. So let us see if I don't know, Arang, would you be interested in answering that? What other concrete demands do you think is coming out of these demands that people are making on the streets of Iran now?
Sure, I'm happy to start, but I'm sure my co-panelists will have ideas or thoughts on this as well. I mean, this is an important question, and it touches or gets at this anxiety that many have had around this question of, well, this is great, this seemingly spontaneous outburst of young Iranians becoming, forcing us to view them as political subjects. This is great. It's spontaneous. It has clearly affected the regime. They clearly are off guard. But the concern that many people have is that, well, what is the leadership? What are the demands? Even if the Islamic Republic wanted to negotiate or engage with this group, who are they going to meet with? Who are they going to negotiate? I think these are legitimate concerns, right? And from what I've seen, it is, I mean, yes, you have, one is just, we want them out. We want the Islamic Republic gone. We want all the clerics gone. So clearly there are some people who want that. If we look at how the protests started, they're about police brutality. They're about systematic discrimination against women and control of their bodies, right? So those you could think of them as a bundle of demands and changes that people want. But it's hard to see, I don't think that's enough, right? It's not enough just to remove the Gash Ershad or the morality police. I think we've gone beyond that. But the bigger question is, well, who's going to represent the demands, right? So if for me, one of the things that does come to go back to the points made earlier is, the concerns of the teachers or the pensioners or the workers in the Haftab Peh in Khuzestan, or is that we want representation. We want to represent our interests vis-a-vis management, vis-a-vis the Ministry of Education, vis-a-vis the parliaments, vis-a-vis lawmaking. It's about representing ourselves. We don't want someone to represent us. We want to represent ourselves. That requires fundamental legal changes, acceptance of independent associations, and quite dramatic legal reforms. So, I mean, that's one way to get at, is that we need, unfortunately, the Islamic Republic is very good at disorganizing society. For us who are sympathetic to this movement, we need to help, or we need to look for ways that this society can reorganize itself across class lines, across ethnic lines, and so forth. The streets are one place for that, but you can't do this on the streets. So let me just end with this one point. Is, so part of this discussion is, well, leaderless has certain strengths, but lots of weaknesses. But having a strong leader has strengths, but we also know it can be incredibly authoritarian, right? In a sense, it can smother the other voices. So in between those two extremes is collective leadership, right? We have revolutions and so forth. I've been spending this past week reading about the Algerian Revolution, and they attempted to create a collective leadership. Well, that requires a sensibility to formulate, have rational debates across different political groups, to create modes of compromise, to listen to one another, to engage in deliberation, to engage in kind of horse trading, compromise and negotiation. And to going back to my earlier comments, unfortunately, even if we just take the Iranian Americans as an example of that, I don't have much hope for that. And as we know, that the Islamic Republic is actively trying to prevent any sort of cross-fertilization between environmentalists and labor workers and teachers and pensioners and so forth. So it's going to be very difficult. So some of this fantasy that people have on Twitter that think the revolution has happened and they're drafting their, buying their plane tickets and stuff is truly unhelpful. I'm sorry to be cynical about it, but we need to do the hard work of organizing rather than just wishing it all away.
Any other comments on that? I mean, I very much feel, Arang, on what you are pointing to. But as you said yourself, there are also voices who say this movement doesn't have one Sad. It is a Hazar Sad movement. It has 1,000 leaders. Therefore, you cannot capture one and kill the leader and kill, kind of end it, which in itself is very interesting and certainly means something. But I also hear you when you say, the structures that could, institutional structures that could exist and be places of negotiation with the upcoming emerging government or force, that they are in such a disarray because of the actions of the Islamic Republic. That has, yes, Negar, بفرمایید.
I just want to add a quick point to Arang's excellent explanation of this, regardless of what comes next, because I'm on the media, I'm constantly asked this, is this the end? Is this the revolution, what's happening next. And it's very difficult to speculate, and I don't want to speculate. I'm also not a historian, but what we've seen in the past protests is that the state has the will and the capacity to use very brutal violence to crack down on the protesters. But regardless of what comes next, I think this in itself is revolutionary. And we're seeing a continuation of this, not just as protests of these collective protests on the street, but also as individual acts of civil disobedience. So we're starting to see images come out of Iran of this grandmother who dropped her hijab without hijab, taking two what looks like her grandchildren to school in the middle of a busy street. These two women who are having a breakfast at a cafe without hijab, posted it to Twitter, was arrested for it subsequently, but nevertheless, the civil disobedience continues. So regardless of what comes after this, I think in itself, the movement is revolutionary.
Okay, this is a very good place actually for me to ask you a question, Negar, which has come through here, which is, what is the role of us here in diaspora, and how, this is exactly a quote, how can Negar explain or defend is the term they use, the ways in which in the past has normalized Islamic Republic? So I don't know if you agree with that you have done so or not, but it is something that I think doesn't apply just to you, it applies to all of us who, as I think Sima pointed out, the moment you start giving a layered, a kind of nuanced picture, it comes across as if you're not saying they're horrible, terrible, then you're normalizing them. But I think it is maybe worth looking at it in the context of journalism, maybe not just you, but journalists. How can they inform people without normalizing the situation that has been, and as things change, what you have said in the past, of course, could have some impact there.
Sure, that's a great question. And I want to take your initial question also as part of this, as far as media coverage, the Western and US and global media coverage of this. There has been massive media coverage. I can attest to that because I'm also doing constant nonstop interviews on this issue with various US, Western, and global media, but I don't think it's enough. One of the reasons I think people on the ground feel like they're in their own little corner in the Middle East, the world doesn't care about them. There is some truth to that, but I think there's also this issue of access for the global media, specifically for Western media. Access to these kinds of events in Iran is very limited. Foreign journalists is not allowed in the country. There are very few of my colleagues who are present on the ground. Even those who are on the ground are limited as far as their mobility, where they can go, where they have permission. There's a lot of threats also against those who are working in the country, and the local journalists also, as I mentioned, at least 40 arrested, others under threat, constantly getting calls from security forces that you need to tone it down. Even for a tweet, sometimes journalists are questioned. And so we see a strong presence of citizen journalists, essentially ordinary protesters, in some instances, even school children, these school girls and some boys filming their own moments of civil disobedience or collective protest and then posting it on social media. The flip side of that, which I also saw in the questions about disinformation, is that there's also when classic media, old school media organizations and the gatekeepers and the editors and the fact checkers are not present, which is the issue of social media, it's very difficult for the regular user without a trained eye to sift this information through and find what's fact, what's a real video, and what's actually disinformation. The place is also rife with disinformation or misinformation, including these smears against journalists. So I think it's still important to rely on a lot of these media organizations while having an eye on the social media. I'm not saying regular users shouldn't look at social media, but also it's important the role that media organizations are playing in verifying these videos, geolocating them, verifying the date, the location, and just sifting through and fact checking a lot of the information that's coming from the country, and separating it from disinformation or misinformation that's put out both by the state, by the regime, because misinformation actually plays a very important role in destroying or hurting these kinds of movements, and also by various interest groups outside the country. So it's very important. And as far as normalizing, I mean, I take that my work speaks for itself. Yes, I think I've done work about the impact of sanctions, for example, on Iranian blanket economic sanctions on the Iranian society, working class, middle class Iranians, vulnerable populations. I've done work on how military conflict and escalation also impacts ordinary citizens on the ground. And I've also documented human rights abuses of the regime, of the Islamic Republic for the past decade and so, and that's why my family has been harassed by the regime and I have to live in exile. I think that speaks for itself. I haven't been back to the country since 2009, and it's disappointing to see these double accusations coming from the regime with the harassment and also from the opposite side. But nevertheless, going back to my original point, I'm sure I've made mistakes in my work. I'm sure everyone here makes mistakes in whatever line of work you're in, but that's different from accusing someone.
Yeah, and I'm sorry if it came across as, putting you on a,
Yes.
but because I think this is an issue we all face when we try to show multiple sides of something which is complex and requires that kind of attention. Sima has had her hand up, so please, Sima, go ahead.
Thank you. I actually wanted to say something about the previous question, which was about the concrete demands that people have on the streets of Iran. And I just wanted to add one point to what Arang said, and that is that yes, there is the element of not having a leader and many demands coming from multiple sides. But some of the ones that if we take women's leadership seriously that have been coming out are some that center, again, Zendegi and Azadi. And I think we need to take those concepts seriously. What does it mean to engage with the notion of women's leadership and women's political participation and leadership and subjecthood? That's one point, I think. And Zendegi, thinking about the politics of life, what kind of life people are asking for. And as I said, and as I have argued in my book, Iranian people are really living a lone life. That is a life that is dire, kind of under the sanctions, and also, in a sense, very kind of unstable in a way that whether it's the sanctions or the expectation by the state repression and the kind of violences of the state or military attack from outside, there's this kind of notion of unstable living. So I think paying attention to that is also important. A life that is livable, right? Not a life that is kind of reduced to the notion of bare life. And also freedom from repression that we talked about. But I also want to think about different ways that people are thinking about freedom, and some of the representations of that, again, as Negar said, and as I was mentioning in terms of the kind of mainstream media, is as if people are asking for the translation or the kind of importing of the freedom that we saw supposedly with the liberation of Iraq or Afghanistan, and that is certainly not the kind of liberation that many people in Iran, from what I'm seeing in the slogans, are asking for, but a freedom that actually comes from the Iranian people exercising their freedoms and not being subjected to the kind of repression that the Iranian state has been subjecting them to. So those notions of freedom and also a life worth living and also women's leadership. And there have been also other slogans, مرگ بر ستمگر چه شاه باشه چه رهبر, which is very clear that it's about, again, repression, whether it comes in through monarchy or whether it comes through the kind of notion of velayat faqih.
Sima John, that's fantastic. I wish we could go on longer, but there's a question for you which may actually tie in with some of what you say. The question says, since you noted a nuanced approach, how do you ensure that your theoretical lens and analysis does not have the blind spot of leaving out the legal framework under which police brutality in the contexts you compared is taking place? Isn't the type of brutality we are seeing in Iran happening within a discriminatory legal framework? I hope that you're clear about that.
If I understand the question, we are talking about the legal discrimination, the laws in Iran that are discriminatory towards women, if I'm understanding correctly. And I think, as I said, many people, many Iranian women, and Arang mentioned, despite the critique that we may have of the 1 million signature campaigns, some of those issues, some of those discriminatory laws, Hazanat, child custody, inheritance, citizenship, and all that were addressed in that. And again, we can think about how they were being strategic and how they were going door to door to do that. So that kind of work has been done both in that sense, and as Arzu Sandu has argued in her work, exactly because of the kind of discriminatory laws in Iran, Iranian women have become very well versed in the law and have kind of educated themselves, and that is exactly why they have been showing a resistance to these laws. So, and I want to make sure that I'm clear that when I talk about my theoretical approach, which is making connections, I'm not at all talking about comparison. I'm actually not in favor of a comparison approach, because you cannot compare two very different contexts. And to me, yes, the history is important. But what I'm talking about, the connections is, how can we think about the rise of security state, whether it is in Iran or the US, that uses and deploys notions of morality in the name of the good of the people, in the name of the public good, to basically govern the population. And that is what I'm talking about. It's not that it's going to be the same. I'm talking about kind of thinking about techniques of governmentality, techniques of normalization that are deployed, albeit in different contexts, but in the name of protecting the people, in the name of humanitarianism by the state. Iranian state, of course, whether we like it or not, still considers to be itself a welfare state and works under the notion of charity. So how is that we can think about human security state in relationship to morality, in relationship to humanitarianism, and not compare, but connect forms of power. And if we want to even simplify it, I said this in the previous panel in another university in Canada, that people have been making points about, look, the gas cans are made in the UK. So how do we actually think about a global framework where we think about militarization, where we think about securitization, without reducing it to a binary of pro-regime against regime, or pro-imperialism or anti-imperialism, and kind of think about nuances of how what happens in real life is not reducible to those binaries. And actually, the strategies of the Iranian state by accusing people, no matter what they say, of being, complicit with the US is similar to those accusations, exactly because of the erasure of nuances, and exactly because making impossible any space for these kind of contradictions and conversations. And these kind of contradictions also in the context of the movement is something that we need to pay attention to, because it's not going to be a unified voice. And I have seen from some of the activists in Iran that they're calling for a shura, right, for a council to bring different groups together and kind of have a collective form of decision making, rather than a rahbar who's sitting, through inheritance of kingdom outside of Iran to be imported, or any kind of other form of political agenda that is predetermined, determined, and assumes leadership, whether it is in the name of feminism, sitting in Washington, D.C., or it's in the name of the people. So I hope it makes sense. I don't know if I approached the question.
Thank you, Sima John. I think you, it made a lot of sense to me. I hope that the person who asked the question had the same feeling. There is a point that I think each one of you could, and I hope would contribute to, and that is, what do we mean by fact-based materials in or conversations in situations where, first of all, finding facts from Iran isn't that easy, but also a lot of the aspects of, how do you measure brutality? How do you have facts about this kind of brutality compared to that? Or, what women go through and what men go through. So I understand, the frustration that the person who asked the question is asking. What are we talking about when we talk about fact-based conversations? So Arang, can I start with you?
Sure. And there's a lot of different ways to get at this. I don't want to get too philosophical about this, but I'm assuming our audience are all based in the U.S. and I've to be very frank, I haven't been able to go to Iran for over 6 years. My family's there. I stay in contact in WhatsApp and so forth, but I have very limited access now. I try my best by newspapers, through magazines, through journals, through email and everything to stay informed. But to give you a very concrete example, I alluded to this earlier. So when the last couple of weeks, we've seen shopkeepers and bazaars shut down. And on social media, people very excitedly started posting these videos and these pictures. And as I mentioned, making these direct references to 1979. But here's an example of how to approach this. This is not so much about facts, but how one interprets. Let's take for granted that, yes, certain shops were closed in certain bazaars in Iran. That's a fact. But the difficult part is the interpretation, right? The people who are hurriedly posting these things had interpreted, and from what I can gather, is that these shopkeepers did it because they supported the protest movement, and this would lead to an expansion of the protests, and this will create, this will bring down the regime. Not only do we not know what it will do in the future, the consequence, but look, how do we know what's going on inside of a shopkeeper's mind? Why they closed down the shop? Yes, it could have been because they were genuinely appalled by the brutality and the violence towards these women and these men. So it could have been because of a sympathy for them, but it could be because they didn't want to have their property owners, right? They didn't want to have their windows smashed. They didn't want their goods stolen and set fire to. So they did it just to protect their own property, or they could have been pressured and forced to close by someone or another. So one thing for all of us who are consuming this information, what I would call, yes, we have to be careful about who's providing us these facts and this information, but I think equally important is to ask yourself, why am I interpreting this information the way I am? Because the interpretation, that's where is mediated by politics, by class, by language, by a whole host of things. And we have to be very careful not to assume certain things about simple facts. Like, yes, Evin prison was on fire last night. Many people probably lost their lives and were injured. Exactly what happened, we don't know. Why it happened, we don't know. And that's where the political contestation emerges. So I'll end with that.
Okay. Negar, do you want to have a stab at that? Oh yeah, you have your hand up, so please.
Definitely. No, I just want to add a comment when we talk about facts. Our job also, as we're on the front line of reporting, I sometimes envy you academics because you have the time to sit back and observe and digest, and then, but for us, it's constant and it's so difficult, especially when you're doing it from a distance, when you don't have a lot of access. Even if you're on the ground, you have to rely on non-conventional sources or methods. So I'll give you a few examples. Amnesty International, one of the top human rights organizations in the world, has documented about over 300, I believe 70 or 50 protesters killed in the 2019 mass protest, Auburn protest. What the language is, and as journalists, a lot of us also, and this is what our editors want, is to rely on human rights organizations who are doing the expert and professional job of documenting. And documenting means they identify either the protester or a family member, they speak to someone, they see images in a way that they can document. And it's the language is at least, we've documented at least this many number killed, but the real figure is probably much higher. I've seen Amnesty International, their staff, their hardworking staff, being attacked and smeared in the same way that you're doing the job of the Islamic Republic, and the real number of deaths are much higher, and you're covering it up. Similar when it comes also, we're talking about facts in news and in analysis. Iranians, quote unquote, Iranians want this, Iranians want that. None of us here know exactly what all Iranians want. In fact, not all Iranians want the same thing. It's very difficult to do polling in the country. Even elections are not completely representative. It's very closed and securitized space. So, for example, for me, I try to mostly say protesters or slogans this and slogans that, as opposed to Iranian. So I think it's one thing for activists and for people who are doing advocacy. They have a much freer hand as far as putting out what they want or what they wish or what they envision, as opposed to people like myself, journalists, analysts, who have to work with facts. It's a very difficult job. You have to sort of check your emotions and your passion out the door, your own wishes and your own visions for what you want, as opposed to what's actually going to happen. And the same goes for academics, all of you doing the same thing. So I think it's these issues that, while also having solidarity, while also having, I'm not saying we're supposed to be heartless or cold about the killings or about the passion of these children and young people who are protesting, but it's different when you're trying to do professional and fact-based work. It takes more time, it's more difficult, and you also, for providing nuance, you get, unfortunately, more heat and attack for it.
Thank you. Sima, do you want to add anything?
No, I agree with everything that Negar and Arang said, and I think that it's difficult to think about facts because what people see on social media, because it's what you see on the camera is assumed often to be the fact because you're seeing it, but every image that you see is mediated in one way or another, and I think it's important to take that into and all of them, of course, have affective elements. They kind of give rise to emotions that then make it very difficult to have some of the conversations that we have been talking about. But yeah, I'm not going to say more about that because I think the other two colleagues covered it really well.
Thank you so much. And there are questions and a whole category of questions about what is going to happen. What do you predict would be the outcome of the movement? And I despite the fact, I can sense the desire, the hope that we could make such a prediction and what's going to come out of it, but I don't think I'm going to subject any of you to that kind of having to predict what's going to happen. But if you could, each one of you maybe mention one or two facts which would be factors that could give indications that a movement, I mean, one of them I think has come out is that this movement is geographically very widespread. That's not just big cities, it's not just middle class. Or that's what I think from what I have read. So if you could just each touch on one or two factors that you think may play a role in make things for us more possible to make judgments on the future of a movement. And if you don't, it's perfectly understandable. So I leave that open to any of you. All right, no predictions. No, that wasn't actually.
I'll just say a couple of things because no predictions, of course.
No predictions.
I don't have a crystal ball. I don't think any of us can say anything. But what I can say is that regardless of what comes next, or how these protests end, because at some point they will end in one way or another, whether it's state repression or whether it is a change in the establishment in the regime. Hopefully, when we say regime change, is also a very loaded term because it's often meant regime change from outside. But the hope is that it will be changed from inside. But whatever it happens, I think to me, it seems like the process itself is very important. And the process is teaching all of us a lot. And the process itself has created change already. And I think the change in the level of the discourse that is happening in Iran and also in diaspora is something that we can appreciate. I appreciate and I see as itself being, again, very, not to use it's a horrible term to say pregnant with possibilities. I don't have a better term for that, but full of possibilities. And I think that is the kind of futurity that I see that comes from these notions of hope, these notions of critical engagement. And despite some of the ways that people are talking about generation of 80s and this and that, I think those arbitrary distinctions are not helpful, but there is kind of participation of all groups of people in this protest, and that is where I see the possibility of change happening in whatever way that it will continue, even if the protests are repressed, which I'm hope they won't be. I think the Iranian state will not be able to contain the energy and the kind of political discourse that has emerged from these protests.
Yeah, I think on that very excellent note, we can begin to end this conversation. Thank you all very much. Let me just...
Her hand up. I'm so sorry to interrupt.
Oh, Negar, I'm so sorry. Please go ahead. Negar, please.
I just wanted to add one more point that's just coming in the news right now. Elnaz Rakabi, when I spoke about that civil disobedience and individual pushback, a rock climber apparently showed up in an international competition today without her hijab. So I don't know what this would mean for her. Will she have to be forced into immediate exile? Can she return to the country? Will she be kicked out of the team? Women have done this in a few instances in the past, and they've had to leave the team or just move to other countries into exile. So it's these very iconic and important images we're also seeing from celebrities, filmmakers, athletes under a lot of pressure, but putting out this message of solidarity with the movement, which in itself, again, I like to call it revolutionary, regardless of whether this is a revolution or not, without speculation about what comes next.
Thank you very much. Excellent piece of news. Let me just give two explanations. there have been questions that I haven't been able to bring up because they were way too long. They were like about 8 or 9 lines, and just reading through that would completely distract me from staying in the conversation that was going on. Not many of them, but a couple of them. So please forgive us for not getting to those. I've also not included Q&As that were direct attacks either on the panel or on the diaspora community in the United States. I mean, there were heated feelings on both sides. So I think that we have managed to keep this hopefully very informative and lively and free of unnecessary friction that is not productive. Thank you all very much. You have been an amazing panel members and very patient with us. We're only about 10 to 4, so I thank you very much for bearing with us this long. And we look forward to seeing all your scholarships coming out and your news reporting and your teaching and all of that. So with that note, thank you and see you all very soon.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Khodafez.
Khodafez. And of course, thank you to the audience. Sorry, I'm too excited with all the conversations. Thank you to our audience. They stayed for a very long time. We had a very healthy audience. Thank you. Bye. Bye-bye now.